Hey, it's Trip here from the 87th. This video is about air refueling operations as I see it in BMS 4.33. Information is current as of update 1. If you look on the HSD while the aircraft is frozen in space and time, you'll see two refueling tracks that I've put on the HSD. This eastern track is the KC-135 track. It's a single line track. I don't bother to put a complete rectangular box around the air refueling track. It's much quicker and easier just to put a single line track. And the western track is the KC-10 track. We'll be refueling behind the KC-10 during this mission. So at any one time, if I need to know where the tankers are, I can zoom in or out with the range on the HSD, locate these tracks, point the airplane in that direction, and then with a little radar work I can find the tankers. Now if I call AWACS up and ask for a vector to tanker, they will give me a vector to the nearest tanker. That may be a KC-135. If I don't want to particularly refuel behind a KC-135, if I have the option, I'll do a little radar work and find the other aircraft, and it would be a KC-10 and refuel behind it. Now they give me an air-to-air TACAN frequency. Typically for the 135 it's 29 Yankee. His call sign is Camel. And for the KC-10 it's 63 Yankee. His call sign is Canteen. So you kind of know who you're going to or what type aircraft before you get there, based on their call sign and their TACAN channel. So if I wanted, I could go to the TACAN ILS page in the DED, put in 63 Yankee air-to-air, and then I would read the distance in the lower right corner of the DED to that tanker. Or I could come down to the HSI and read that same distance in this miles window if I had the mode selector in TACAN. Now with the KC-135, you only get distance information here. You don't get any bearing information. The head of the bearing pointer just continuously circles the compass card. But with the KC-10, you get mileage and a bearing. So it points to the aircraft, tells you which way to turn, what heading to turn to go directly to that aircraft. Well, as I said, I don't use that technique. I use this technique. I can put these steer point lines on the map very easily before I drop into the cockpit, and then save them with the DTC so that they're available when I drop into the aircraft. Alright, so it's an odd thing that when you get that TACAN channel from AWACS, that you don't have to add 63 numbers to it like you'd normally do if you were tied to another airplane using air-to-air TACAN, another human aircraft. So if the lead was on 29 Yankee, I would have to add 63 numbers to that, and I would set 92 Yankee in my DED. That way we would have distance between us in the lower right corner of the DED, but apparently you don't have to do that with a tanker. Another oddity is you don't have to be on the same UHF frequency as the tanker, or the AWACS for that matter. Whenever you request something from either one, you'll always be able to get a reply, regardless of what your UHF radio is tuned to. Now the book mentions channel 12 for refueling operations, the UHF frequency, but they don't make a point that you have to be on it in order to hear the tanker responses. Now the other oddity that I noticed is that, especially with a 135, because I guess that's what I refuel behind the most, but if I program him, and when I'm making a TE, to be at say 24,000 feet and 350 knots for the refueling, then he will kind of disregard that on his own, and he'll descend down to 22,000 feet and fly at 300 knots. So that's pretty much what you can count on, regardless of what you've tried to program him to do during the mission planning. Alrighty. Now, when I'm making let me lock up the KC-135 here. Let's go to air-to-air radar, and I'm going to do a I'm going to hold TMS right until I switch to TMS, and then I'm going to do a quick burst of TMS right, and that's going to lock up the closest airplane to me. And I can see right here that that's going to be the KC-10 because he's on this westerly track, and he's going away from us. That's good. It's going to be a nice, easy intercept. I've sent the second element home and just kept the number 2, the wingman, to uncomplicate things. Speaking of that, if I had just my wingman with me, I would put him in a fighting wing formation for the rendezvous, and that way he's free to maneuver behind me in that 30 to 60 degree cone. He can be to my left, to my right, up or down, but not directly at my 6 o'clock position. And he's free to maneuver as he sees fit as I make these turns to do the rejoin. Now this is a nice gentle rejoin. It's not going to be a problem, but if I had to make a kind of a hard high bank, high G turn, I would want him to have the freedom to maneuver so that he can keep me and the tanker in sight the whole time he's turning with me to make the rejoin. So that's very helpful to him. Now if I had a 4-ship or a 3-ship for that matter, and I was going to make a tight high G turn, there's no way I would have the flight in echelon, any kind of an echelon formation or close, really close wing formation. That would just be pure chaos when we made that turn. So my thinking is, if I had a 4-ship flight, I would put the second element in something like a 2 or 3 mile trail and let them operate as an independent element. Let them make their own rejoin with the tanker. I know they're going to the left wing of the tanker because that's where they're supposed to be, the observation position, while 1 and 2 are refueling. So just let them proceed on their own, stay a couple thousand feet above or below me so that they don't interfere with my rejoin with the tanker. We don't all collide. Now speaking of collisions, if I was making a turning rejoin or a straight ahead rejoin with any aircraft, whether it's the tanker or another wingman, if I'm the number 2 aircraft, I would never be at the same altitude as the target aircraft because there's too high a possibility of a collision, especially if the visibility is down, or if I go in and out of clouds and I lose sight of the target aircraft, or maybe my closure rate is way too high and out of control and I go shooting right by the lead aircraft as I approach him. I don't want to be at the same altitude as he's at, otherwise I could risk colliding with him. So typically for a straight ahead or returning rejoin, the wingman comes in at a lower altitude than the target aircraft, and then as he gets things under control and he knows he can keep the target in sight and his closure rate is under control, then he can start moving up in altitude and eventually up on the wing of the target aircraft or whatever the formation is called for. Alright, so don't stay at the same altitude as your target is for the initial rejoin. Alrighty, I'm going to let the airplane roll here, and we're going to try and complete this turn. So I'm at 20,000 feet, the target's at 22, so I'm going to stay here for the rejoin. I need to get some speed up here. I've got weapons on board, so I can't go too fast without overstressing those pylons and weapons. But I need to get the rejoin speed up here, the closure speed. Right now, if I look on the FCR, I've got 75 knots and increasing. I find that same number up here. This is rounded to the nearest 10 knots. This gives the exact number of knots here. I know his heading is, or his airspeed is 270. That's very typical of what they're going to be doing. So I'm just kind of rolling in behind the tanker. That's probably about as fast as I'm going to be able to go with weapons on board. And so I've got 150 knot closure speed. That's kind of minimum. We're still 12 miles behind the tanker. He's at 22, so yeah, that's a minimum closure speed, but it's about all I can do right now, so we'll just have to go with it. I put my wingman in a fighting wing, so he's free to maneuver. So looking pretty good here. If my wingman needs fuel worse than I do, then one technique I could use is I could get within 10 miles and request fuel, and then immediately tell the tanker I'm done fueling, and then you'll clear the number 2 wingman in. If it was a 4-ship and number 3 needed fuel, then number 2 would do the same thing. He would just immediately tell the tanker he's done, so that number 3 can get on the boom. Now that doesn't mean that number 1 and number 2 can't get fuel. What the number 1 is going to have to do is he's going to have to make sure that he is at least 4,500 feet away from the tanker, and then he's going to request fuel again with the Y1 command on the keyboard. And now the boom operator will clear the lead aircraft in to refuel first. So 4,500 feet I find is the range that you have to be from the tanker. So this is another reason that I don't put the tanker's air-to-air attack in. I leave, in this case we're a 2-ship here, I leave the wingman's, I set up air-to-air attack in with him, so if he's on the boom, I'm reading his distance here. When it gets to 6 or 7/10 of a mile, I know I'm far enough back and I can request refueling again, and now the tanker is going to clear me into the pre-contact position. So we're 170 knots back. I'm doing about as good an airspeed as I can expect at this point. Minimum of 180 at this distance is good. Now I have some ways I can control the overtake. I can slam the throttle to idle, or use some other reduced thrust setting, or I could pop out the speed brakes and slow up pretty drastically that way. Maybe do some S-turns if I had to. That's getting pretty drastic. But I can always put the power back up and close the speed brakes and build the overtake if I overcooked it a little bit or undercooked it a little bit. I can adjust the speed with throttle. All right, I'm going to come on track IR for this rejoin, and alright, we're looking pretty good. There's the tanker. Let's see what he's doing down here. It looks like he's going to start a turn. This is the oddest thing about Falcon in general, is just the behavior of the tanker. They've come a long way, but they have a long way to go. He's not at the end of the track. He shouldn't be turning here. I know I've got him on radar. I kind of suspect at one point that, well, maybe he senses somebody's got him locked up on radar and he's doing some evasive maneuvering, but that's not the case, because I've been in the same position where he'll do the same thing even when I've never locked him up to begin with. So we're going to have to go with what we got here. 150 knots, we're 2 miles behind him. So at some point I'm going to drop my radar contact, which is probably right about here is a good time. I don't need to be painting him with all that radar energy. It's not healthy for an airplane that's loaded with JP5 or 4 or whatever they use. Alright, so I'm just doing this visually. I know he's doing 270 knots here. I'm going to start slowing up, and I'm going to request refueling. Open my refueling door. Let the speed get a little bit too low, so I'm too far back to be doing 30 knots of overtake. There's the boom down now. I'm going to let the speed build up a little bit. Yeah, so if one of your element or wingmen are low on fuel, you don't want to take all day about getting onto the boom. He's starting to get big in the window here. I'm going to start bleeding off some speed and start climbing up to his altitude now. One reason I'm down here is to avoid the wake turbulence. And I have to put myself, now look at that, he's rolling out wings level. All those bad things I said about tankers. Alrighty. Put my nose right up to the boom there, and he'll eventually clear me into the contact position. 27 knots of overtake, and you can see that we're making some good progress up toward the tanker. A little bit high here, getting a little bit of turbulence. Speed's coming down. Just trying to get up here close to his boom so I can get cleared in. Alrighty. I'm thinking somewhere close to here. A lot of my attention's on the flight path marker, and I'm just keeping that on the horizon. And that's how I'm maintaining my reference, my distance from the tanker. I look a little low, so I'm going to come up a bit. I don't try to fly off the tanker itself, but I fly the flight path marker on the horizon. So just goose it with a little bit of throttle so I can slide forward. Now that looks right about right. So 300 knots, I know he's doing that. We should get contact lights right here. And boom. No, he wants me to come up a little bit further. Alright, I can do that. Maybe a little bit higher. Maybe a little bit higher. A little bit higher. There we go. Alright, now there's a couple ways you can disconnect. You can do an AR disconnect. It's the same as nose wheel steering. But if you do an AR disconnect before you've got all your gas, then you'll have to hit Y2 and tell them you're ready again. So what people normally do is they just tear the boom right out of the receptacle by exceeding the boom limits. So I'm going to pull the power back, and the boom operator is going to initiate the disconnect. But the advantage of this is that I don't have to take my eyes down and hit the Y1 on the keyboard. If you have that programmed in your stick, that's great, but I don't. So I'm going to come back in here and hook up one more time and show you the proper way that I terminate a refueling operation. Alright, there's a connection, and what I do is I hit the AR disconnect, and that causes the boom operator to terminate refueling. I open the speed brakes and start a slide back as I descend slightly, close the speed brakes, and then tell the tanker that I'm done refueling, and then close the refueling door, and then take up my position on the right wing and let the number 2 aircraft refuel. Alright, I'm going to freeze it here in the 2D mode and just make one more comment. Before you drop into the game, you have the option of selecting either easy, simplified, or realistic for your refueling. If you're part of an online mission where somebody's hosting, they have the option of specifying what they're going to allow during the TE or the campaign. So in one box they could put, for instance, simplified. So if they allow simplified, then that means you can select either simplified or realistic. You can't select less than simplified. So you couldn't set it on easy. And of course, if they only allowed realistic, you would have to use realistic refueling. Now, I know some of you may not be any good at all on air refueling. Maybe your stick is giving you problems. You cannot get on and stay on the boom. You have to use easy refueling, and that's completely understandable. You know, the mission may be built so that when you come back from the attack or whatever you're doing, you have to refuel in order to get home. So the only way you're going to get home is either go to an alternate that's close by or refuel. So in that case, you're stuck with easy refueling. So you would have that as an option, hopefully. You don't want to use that routinely, you know, just to rely on it like a crutch, because eventually you want to learn to refuel at least in the simplified mode, and then when you get proficient at that, the realistic mode. This is something you really have to practice quite often. Probably every other time you fly, until you get proficient at it, you need to do some kind of formation flying or air refueling practice. Otherwise, you're just not going to get it. All right, I think that's all I wanted to talk about. I hope this helps in some way, and trip out.